Steve Jobs had access to the world. Welcome to Copilot Podcasts. Steve Jobs had access to the world's best doctors, unlimited money, and a cancer with a 96% survival rate. Yet he died at 56. Today we're exploring the collision between personal life extension choices and state health responsibilities, specifically how individual autonomy clashes with collective medical obligations. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why even the most advanced healthcare systems struggle with this fundamental tension and what it means for patients facing life or death decisions. Let me bring in someone who's been thinking deeply about these issues to help us unpack this complex story.
The Steve Jobs case is fascinating because it perfectly illustrates this tension. Here was someone with pancreatic neuroendocrine tumor, not the deadly pancreatic cancer most people think of, but a much more treatable condition with a 5-year survival rate of 96%.
Wait, 96%? That's incredible odds. So what went wrong?
Jobs discovered the tumor when he had no symptoms, meaning it was completely curable at that point. But he had this deep aversion to surgery, to having his body cut open. Instead, he chose a strict vegetarian diet, fasting, and even colon cleansing.
That sounds almost ideological?
Exactly. According to the medical experts who analyzed his case, Jobs was influenced by a book that claimed all diseases stem from mucus buildup. The theory was that meat and dairy create mucus, while fruits and vegetables eliminate it. He truly believed this approach would cure him.
But surely the doctors warned him about this approach.
Oh, they were horrified. Dr. Lee Nak-jun, an ENT specialist who studied the case, said, quote, "Why would he do such a thing? I can't understand it. He was someone who received scientific education." The doctors knew that fasting weakens cancer patients so much they can't even undergo surgery or chemotherapy later.
So his choice to refuse conventional treatment actually eliminated his future options?
Precisely. By the time Jobs finally agreed to surgery, 9 months after diagnosis, the cancer had spread throughout his body. And even then, he continued making questionable choices, drinking only fruit smoothies.
Fruit smoothies? That seems harmless enough.
Actually, it was devastating. Dr. Lee explained that fruit juices are loaded with sugar, and Jobs' pancreas was already compromised from surgery. The high sugar intake was literally feeding the cancer cells while putting enormous strain on his weakened pancreatic function.
This is where it gets really interesting though, right? Because Jobs had every right to make these choices, even if they were medically disastrous.
That's the heart of the dilemma. Jobs assembled the world's best medical team and even became the first patient to undergo cutting-edge genetic sequencing analysis, which cost over 100 million won at the time. Today, that same test costs just 140,000 won.
So he had access to the most advanced medicine available, but still chose to reject it. That's his right, isn't it?
Absolutely. And this is where the broader implications become clear. If someone with unlimited resources and access to the best medical care can make choices that seem irrational to medical experts, what does that mean for healthcare systems trying to balance individual autonomy with collective responsibility?
Right, because healthcare isn't just about individual choices, there are broader social implications. Let's talk about how this plays out in Korea specifically.
Korea's approach is really fascinating. The country has this law called the Life-Sustaining Treatment Decision Act, which was supposed to protect patient autonomy in end-of-life care. But it's created some bizarre contradictions.
What kind of contradictions?
The law distinguishes between terminal patients and patients in the dying process. You can only refuse life-sustaining treatment if you're in the dying process, meaning death is imminent. But if you're just terminal, even with no hope of recovery, you legally cannot refuse treatments like ventilators.
Wait, that seems backwards. You're saying someone who's clearly dying but not dying fast enough has fewer rights?
Exactly. You could have written an advance directive saying you don't want to be kept alive on machines, but if you develop respiratory failure while only terminal, the law requires doctors to put you on a ventilator anyway.
That's actually creating more suffering, isn't it?
It often does. And it highlights this fundamental tension between individual self-determination rights and the state's constitutional obligation to protect life. Korea's constitution guarantees both the right to human dignity and the state's duty to protect citizens' lives.
So we have competing constitutional principles here. How do other countries handle this?
Most developed countries struggle with the same tension, but Korea's approach is particularly restrictive. The law was actually created in response to specific court cases, like the 2009 case of an elderly woman whose family wanted to remove her ventilator based on her previously expressed wishes.
And the courts allowed it?
Yes, but only for patients in irreversible dying processes. The Supreme Court was very careful to limit the scope. They were trying to balance respect for individual autonomy with protecting vulnerable patients from pressure to choose death.
That's a legitimate concern, though, right? The worry that economic or social pressures might influence these decisions?
Absolutely. And this is where the Steve Jobs case becomes even more relevant. He had unlimited resources, no economic pressures, and still made choices that medical experts considered harmful. It shows that even in ideal circumstances, people might choose paths that seem irrational.
But there's something interesting about Jobs bringing his son Reed to treatment discussions. Reed now works in cancer research and startup investments. It's like Jobs was thinking about the broader implications of his choices.
That's a crucial point. Individual medical decisions don't happen in isolation. They affect families, healthcare systems, and society's understanding of medical authority versus personal autonomy.
And in Korea's case, the state has decided it needs to be more paternalistic to protect people from potentially harmful choices?
That's one interpretation. But critics argue it's actually creating more ethical dilemmas. When patients can't exercise their autonomy until they're literally dying, it forces families and doctors into impossible situations.
Can you give me a concrete example of how this plays out in Korean hospitals today?
Sure. Imagine a patient with advanced cancer who's written an advance directive refusing artificial life support. They develop pneumonia and need a ventilator. Under current law, doctors must provide the ventilator because the patient is only terminal, not in the immediate dying process.
So the patient's clearly expressed wishes are ignored?
Exactly. The law prioritizes the state's obligation to preserve life over individual autonomy until death becomes truly imminent. It's a very narrow window for self-determination.
This seems to create a system where the state is making medical decisions rather than patients or even doctors.
That's a fair characterization. And it reflects a broader philosophical question. When individual choices conflict with collective medical wisdom or social values, who should have the final say?
The Steve Jobs case suggests that even medical wisdom isn't always right, though. I mean, he lived longer than many expected, even with his unconventional choices.
That's true, but he also died from a highly treatable cancer. The medical consensus was that early surgery would have saved his life. His choices may have extended his life somewhat, but they ultimately cost him decades.
But those were his decades to lose, weren't they?
Philosophically, yes, but practically, his death affected Apple, thousands of employees, millions of customers, and the broader tech industry. Individual medical choices have ripple effects.
So where does that leave us? How do we balance individual autonomy with collective responsibility?
I think the key is recognizing that this tension is inherent and probably can't be fully resolved, but we can create better frameworks for navigating it. Korea's current approach is too rigid.
What would a better framework look like?
More nuanced definitions of patient autonomy, better support for informed decision-making, and recognition that the dying process isn't always clearly defined. The current law tries to create bright-line rules for inherently gray situations.
And presumably better education about medical realities so people can make more informed choices?
Absolutely. Jobs had access to the world's best medical advice, but was influenced by pseudoscientific theories. That suggests we need better ways to help people evaluate medical information.
But even with perfect information, some people will still make choices that seem irrational to medical experts.
True. And maybe that's okay. The question is whether society should protect people from their own choices or respect their autonomy even when we disagree with their decisions.
It sounds like Korea has chosen protection over autonomy, at least in end-of-life situations.
Yes, but it's created this paradox where patients have more autonomy when they're healthy enough to refuse treatment than when they're actually dying, and most need that autonomy.
That does seem backwards. You'd think the closer someone is to death, the more their wishes should matter.
Exactly. And this is where the constitutional tension becomes most acute. The state's duty to protect life conflicts most directly with individual autonomy at precisely the moment when personal choice should matter most.
So when you step back from all this, what's the bigger picture here? What does the collision between individual choice and state responsibility really tell us about modern healthcare?
I think it reveals that we're still figuring out how to handle the power that modern medicine gives us. We can extend life in ways previous generations couldn't imagine, but we haven't fully worked out the ethics of when and how to use that power.
And the Steve Jobs case shows that even unlimited resources can't resolve these fundamental tensions between individual autonomy and collective medical wisdom.
Right. His story is a reminder that these aren't just policy questions. They're deeply personal decisions about how we want to live and die, and what role we want medical institutions to play in those choices.
And for listeners facing these decisions themselves or with family members, the key takeaway is understanding both your rights and the limitations of those rights within your healthcare system.
Absolutely. Know what advance directives can and can't do, understand the legal framework in your country, and have honest conversations with family and doctors about your values and preferences.
Because ultimately, these decisions happen in the context of real families dealing with real medical crises, not abstract policy debates.
Exactly. The law and policy matter, but so do the human relationships and values that shape how we navigate these impossible choices.
Well, this brings us back to where we started, with Steve Jobs and his 96% survival rate cancer. His story reminds us that even with the best medical care available, the tension between individual choice and collective wisdom remains unresolved. Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. The next time you hear about someone making a medical decision that seems irrational, remember that the collision between personal autonomy and state responsibility is one of the defining challenges of modern healthcare, and there are no easy answers.